Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. If Mercedes truly want to attract Max Verstappen from Red Bull to their team, they'll need to prove that they are still capable of actually building a decent Formula 1 car, because Jeddah was another disaster for Mercedes, their second in a row so far this season, and Toto Wolff is admitting their performance leaves serious questions on the table. They believe there might be a fundamental problem with their car that they are yet to understand. Their simulation tools, again, playing havoc, their high-speed corner performance nowhere near expectations. What is going on at Mercedes? Is this team destined for an eternal downfall? Very much intrigued your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. As always, I greatly appreciate it. There's plenty of topics to dive into today. Lots of reaction as well, of course, to the race. Max Verstappen, by the way, is having got on a 10 streak, of course, last season. He's now on another 9 wins in a row. And naturally, in this sport, you do get periods of dominance, but I think usually there is something else going on. And honestly, this season is shaping up to be one of the worst in a rather long time, just because of the dirty air effect and the fact that the racing, the quality of racing further down the field does not seem to have been maintained what we saw, for example, back in 2022. The Saudi Arabian Grand Prix had the fewest overtakes of any Grand Prix in Jeddah so far, only 25 overtakes, most of which were from Bearman, who only had 4 to be fair, but still they were the most of them. So last year had 36, the year before had 32, the year before that had 27. So the fewest have since so far, and I think just generally watching the races, sure, Max drives off into the distance, but it's not like there's much going on elsewhere. And of course, we saw that really with the Hamilton-Piastri battle, where Piastri, good defense from Hamilton for sure, but Piastri couldn't get through, and Hamilton was losing so much time in Sector 1 behind Norris due to dirty air, but also the absolute disastrous high-speed performance of that Mercedes, and we'll dive into that in a second. Also, some drama on the Kevin Magnussen defend like a Viking strategy, right? And it has called into question whether the time penalty feature we currently use actually works, because basically, when Magnussen got his penalty, Haas decided, all right, there's no way Magnussen's going to get points. So how about we just use Kevin to hold up the pack as much as possible? I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with holding up the pack. I mean, like, people praise it when Perez did it with Hamilton 2021 Abu Dhabi, right? So, I think it's part of the sport. I think what McLaren, I think it was RB, what they were annoyed about was that Magnussen seemed to take a position off track and then hold everyone up. So they weren't happy about it. And to be fair, it worked a treat for Haas, right? Because they ended up getting Hülkenberg into the points and scoring 1 point as a result of all these shenanigans. Does raise a question to me whether the whole idea of because he had 20 seconds of penalties applied after the race was over. So does that really make much difference when you can just hold up the field? Maybe the argument is we should go back to either stop-go penalties or drive-throughs. I don't know why we don't do drive-throughs anymore. To me, they made so much sense. Because you say, all right, Magnussen, this is your penalty for, the errors you've made during the Grand Prix. It's not 10 seconds added to your race time at the end. It's a drive-through penalty that you've got to do within the next 3 laps. And that kind of resolves some of these issues. So fair play to Haas. I thought they were gaming the system somewhat here, but of course, they made it work for them. I wouldn't be surprised either if Magnussen is gone next season in favour of Oliver Bearman, right? Because the way that he performed this weekend, stellar performance. Driver of the day, absolutely hands down. And I wouldn't be too surprised if he actually is in a Ferrari in a few years' time. But of course, in the short term, there's plenty else going on in the driver market. This was spotted yesterday, actually, with here's Toto Wolff in the background. And this is Carlos Sainz Sr., Carlos Sainz's father, in the foreground, discussing seemingly with Toto the possibilities about a drive next season. Hamilton's going to Ferrari. Of course, Sainz's number one option theoretically could be Mercedes, but of course, in reality, it might be Red Bull. We've discussed that in recent times, but based on recent rumours, maybe Red Bull aren't so interested in Sainz, and possibly Mercedes is the best bet that he has on the table. Now, Mercedes themselves, Toto Wolff especially, has been saying everything possible to try and find a way to get Max Verstappen to join Mercedes, and he's obviously given Helmut Marko an offer, and he said, look, if Marko wants to join, we'd welcome him and all this. And Marko says yesterday, very nice, but at the moment I can thankfully decline this offer. So there has been some sort of break in the Red Bull chaos train when after the last night in Jeddah, there was discussions within the team. They had some, decent, apparently amicable conversations between Mintzlaff and Marko and Horner and everyone behind the scenes. And apparently today, Mintzlaff, the CEO, is going to meet with a Thai board in Dubai to discuss the future of this. And if that goes well, then sure, maybe for the immediate term, things are going to get papered over. But I feel like, again, this is papering over some cracks. There's no doubt about it as far as I'm concerned. If Marko, if Verstappen, if Horner, if Mintzlaff all remain in their respective roles, there's no way that there isn't still friction going on there behind the scenes. And whatever you believe happens behind the scenes over the last few days with Marco, apparently this cunning plan to get rid of Marco that Christian Horner said, no, don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Media Man. I definitely had nothing to do with that. There was no such involvement from myself. And, look, I think it's all smoke and mirrors at times at the end of the day. But as Horner said, nobody is bigger than the team. Of course, that applies to himself. That applies to the guys on his team. And of course, that also applies to Max Verstappen, right? And that's been one of the rumours from maybe you knew as well, that Christian Horner believes that even without Max and without Newey and without Marco, he's still capable of building a team that can win championships. And maybe you guys agree with that, maybe you don't. But that is the way things might go. But if Marco was to go and Verstappen was to go, of course, there would be questions as to where Verstappen would end up. And maybe Ferrari are thinking, well, I don't think they're going to regret signing Hamilton because I think it makes so much sense of so many parties. But, if Ferrari had have known Verstappen might have been available, could have been a different story, right? And maybe he's not available. But over what's happened over the last few days, it seems at least plausible. I estimated a few days ago there was like a 60% chance that this might well happen. I think I'm going to revise the estimate down somewhat, mainly because Mercedes are in an absolute disastrous position right now. Like, if Mercedes were as competitive as they thought they were going to be, and building massive confidence in their project and their team going into 2026, which is what Max is probably really looking for in a couple of years' time, because there's a feeling that Red Bull might not be best positioned in 2026 than Ferrari or Mercedes are. Ferrari are building strong right now. Fred Vasseurs cooking a masterclass. Yes, they're not quite where Red Bull are, and I don't think anybody really expected anyone to be, but they've made more progress over the last several months, Ferrari, than any team have. They're bringing new people on all the time. I think it was Jerome D'Ambrosio of Mercedes is due to be joining Ferrari, Loic Serra due to be joining Ferrari, rumours that maybe Pierre Wache, even Adrian Newey might be going to Ferrari as well. Of course, Hamilton's going next year. So Ferrari are making big steps, but Mercedes, the same cannot be said for that. Toto Wolff says, I'd love to have Verstappen. It's a decision Max needs to take. There's no team up and down the grid who wouldn't do handstands to have him in their car. And Helmut Marko also giving praise to Ferrari and saying that, Red Bull had more deg than they expected with the hard tyre. Ferrari are getting closer. He expects that their performance advantage over Ferrari in Australia, Japan and China might not be the same. Gotta say, Japan, on the evidence of the last couple of days, will be a nightmare for Mercedes. Like, if what they're currently suffering from is actually real and, they don't understand it, that Sector 1 in Japan, they are going to get cooked. So this, of course, the man that's designed the RB20. Many other people also involved, but Adrian Newey looking up at Max Verstappen here, and, the level of dominance at this point is frankly unprecedented. But lots of discussion on the Mercedes W15 and exactly why it's not where they expected it to be. To be honest, going into this season, I expected Ferrari and Mercedes to both be challenging, not really Max, but certainly challenging Perez, right? And maybe there's been something of a challenge there, but so far this season, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, it's been Ferrari that have been the more competitive outfit of the two, and honestly, Mercedes have at times been absolutely nowhere. And if you're Max and you're seeing all the drama internally at Red Bull, which certainly exists, and you're thinking, all right, maybe I need to go somewhere else, maybe it makes sense for me to go somewhere else at some point in the near future, Mercedes would be the most sensible option. But is there much confidence, even within Mercedes, that they're still capable of building a great car? Because arguably, the W15 so far this season has looked worse than, especially at Jeddah, than the last couple of cars. I mean, they were 8.5 tenths off pole this time out in Jeddah. And it wasn't that bad last year. It was like 5 tenths, I think, 5-6 tenths. So in some sense, they've got worse. Now, Bahrain, they were better, but Bahrain more rear limited. Not as many high-speed corners, and we'll discuss that in a second. And I think both Mercedes drivers yesterday drove a solid race. I mean, Hamilton, of course, defended for a very long time against Piastri. He had the fresher hard tyres. Hamilton was on older mediums, defended for like 35 laps against Piastri, then came into the pits, put the soft on, of course, went to the ends. But, Hamilton probably had the pace to get past Norris. He was the faster car, I would say, but he wasn't able to get the job done because of the performance delta in the first sector. These were the numbers, by the way. So Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc. Hamilton was actually faster over the race than Russell was, but of course strategy meant that Russell finished ahead. They took the gamble with Hamilton and Norris, didn't pay off, but I think it was probably worth taking for both teams. But the Mercedes, 7.5 tenths off where Max was, and they were losing the vast majority of that in just the first sector alone, if not just the first couple of corners alone. So obviously Mercedes made some degree of sacrifice this weekend in terms of how they were going to trade off their cornering performance and their straight line speed. They ended up going for a lower downforce rear wing, so they had great straight line speed Mercedes, which meant they were really difficult to overtake. But the problem was that they sacrificed a lot in Sector 1. Now, I don't think this level of sacrifice was intended at all. Just have a look at this, right? So this is Hamilton chasing Norris. Here they come down into turn 4. Now Hamilton goes through turn 4, gets actually a big snap of oversteer here. So I imagine that was probably dirty air induced to some degree, but also the W15 not really performing particularly well. But have a look at this. So this is where Norris is coming out of this corner. This is where he is after the next corner. You can barely see him. This is him in the distance, just a couple of pixels. And then as they come to the end of sector 1, this is Norris. You can barely see him on the screen. So, here he is with his lights flashing. So this is the same car that was here in front of Hamilton just like 3 corners before, and then he was over here. And, it's not like Hamilton was driving poorly. The W15 just had no high-speed performance in those corners. The McLaren was good, and they're running more downforce, more wing, so it's probably expected, and there's the dirty air effect. But Hamilton was losing a second in those couple of corners. It was just absurd, and there was really nothing that they could do. And the same story that wasn't really noted as much, but it was the same story with Russell and Alonso further up the field, that, Russell was in 1.5 seconds of Alonso, was trying to keep up with him. They had the straight line speed, but they did not have the sector 1 performance to make their work at all. So this is what Hamilton said after the race. You could actually tell that he was pretty downbeat here, and understandably, because he discusses the strategy, but the car is relatively good in the low speed, not so bad in the medium, but in the high speed, we are miles off. It was like I was in a different category when I was going through the high speed between the other guys around me. Going on to say it's frustrating for sure to be 3 years in a row in almost the same position. It's definitely tough. We'll get our heads down. We'll keep working away. I know everyone back in the factory is pushing as hard as they can. We've got to make some big changes, We haven't made a big enough change, perhaps. You look at the 3 teams ahead of us. They still have different concepts to where we are in some areas. So we've got some performance to add. So I think the Hamilton is seeing this and thinking, you know what? I'm glad that I left out Mercedes and go to join Ferrari next year, because right now that looks like absolutely the correct move to make. With the trajectories of the 2 respective teams, Toto Wolff went on to say the same thing. Today was not a good day, struggling with the car in the high speed, competitive elsewhere, but in 3 corners in that first sector, losing half a second. Incredibly difficult for the drivers to attack with, so much learning to take, lots, to put our heads down and analyse and to improve. And he goes on to say slightly later on about the fact that he's 100% sure they can make this turnaround, but, it's difficult to really believe Mercedes at this point when they say that they're going to get on top of these problems, because they turn up to Bahrain, they thought they had a really damn competitive car, and at least they thought, well, you know what, the car's great, but it's just we're lacking a bit of downforce. Whereas now they're saying, after going to Jeddah, well, the car actually maybe isn't so great, and there might be actual serious problems underlying in this car that we simply don't understand, because Toto says they measure the downforce, they see the downforce the car generates, but it doesn't produce that when they get to the track. Have we heard this story before with Mercedes? Absolutely, right? We've heard this for the last couple of years. Oh, the simulations, they don't match what's happening in reality. Oh, guys, the simulations are fixed. Don't worry, the simulations are solved. We've got it under control. Oh, hang on a second, we've had another bad race and actually the simulations don't work again. It's like, what is going on at Mercedes? They should have fixed this after year 1. Year 2 was inexcusable. Year 3 is downright embarrassing if they've got this wrong again, which it seems like they have. Toto went on to say this then in the article. We know that we've got a smaller rear wing. We're compensating what we're losing through the corners, but it's the high speed we're losing all of the lap time. I think it's a biggie. There's only so much you can tune here. Our simulations point us in a direction. There's this kind of setup range we choose where you put the right rear wing on, but it's just not working. I think you'll gain a few tenths, but it's a fundamental thing. We believe the speed should be there. We measure the downforce, but we don't find it in the lap time. And elsewhere, Toto was mentioned to the media in a couple of places that they think Mercedes might have an issue, with their simulation software, which, wow, what a surprise after the last couple of years. But this is pretty crazy, right, for them to turn up to Saudi Arabia, and it's not been a great track for them in the last couple of years anyway, but for them to turn up here after Bahrain wasn't great, but their feeling was after Bahrain, well, we just got the cooling settings wrong. If we got the cooling settings right, they think they'd have been the second fastest car that weekend. That's basically what was implied as a result. Maybe they wouldn't have quite caught Leclerc, but, that was the feeling, that they had way more performance in the tank than they were showing. This weekend, sure, the cooling wasn't a problem, but all of a sudden they've got this fundamental problem in the high-speed corners that they simply can't understand. So it's a real headache for Mercedes, but it's also a major headache for Toto Wolff, because if this Mercedes car was at least fundamentally sound, which we thought that it was after Bahrain, to be fair, the feeling was during Bahrain and after Bahrain that probably the car is sounds, it just doesn't have the downforce, and Red Bull have taken big steps forward in terms of getting the platform, and now they're adding loads of performance to the car. Mercedes felt like after Bahrain, they had the platform, but, now it's time to add the performance. But as George says, for 2 weekends in a row, the pace has fallen away from us over the weekends. This hasn't been our competitors getting faster, we've been getting slower. We need to understand why that is, because, they topped practice, right, on day 1 back in Bahrain. There was obviously a lot of confidence around the team at that that moment, and all of a sudden, they now have, fundamental issues with their car once again. So just so many questions for Mercedes to answer and figure out and to deal with here. But also, if I'm Max Verstappen, yes, there is chaos internally at Red Bull. And if Mercedes looked like an attractive option, then there's been some discussion, I think for good reason, why that move could make some degree of sense. But as it presently looks, if I'm Max, I'm like, why would I join a team that's falling off as hard as Mercedes presently are? Because is there any confidence, if I'm Max, that I look at Mercedes and I say, yeah, you know what, for 2026, they'll be back. It's like, it's still going to be ground effect cars to some degree. And have they shown any real evidence in recent times that Mercedes are going to be bouncing back in 2026? Ferrari, really, seems like the place to be if you're going to leave Red Bull. But, that ship may have sailed with the recent confirmations, right? So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, if Max was to go, probably Red Bull would also replace Perez because, they would need someone theoretically who can more so carry the weight because it's difficult to replace Max, of course. But actually, Perez, after getting his penalty yesterday for unsafe release in the pit lane, basically blocking off Fernando Alonso, got some more penalty points. He's actually only 4 points away from a race ban now because plenty of penalty points during last season. Don't think he's going to get there, but there's still 15 races to go until he's going to lose any points. So if he picks up 4 more penalty points in the next 15 races, which is quite possible, especially if some of the other cars close the gap. Like, Perez has been holding his own so far. I will say for Perez, I think he's recognised he can't beat Max. I think he even said this after qualifying, that he was like, the lap that Max did, that's not possible for me. Like, that 127.4, Perez is like, yeah, I ain't able to do that. And, Perez has realised, you know what? Fine, I can't beat Max, at least just settle in for the long haul, and it seems to be what he's doing, and I think it's the correct decision. I think it's working out well for him so far, but if the other teams close the delta, and I think Ferrari probably can, at least to some degree over the season. I also thought before the season began, Mercedes would be in that mix. I thought that it was going to be Red Bull and then Ferrari, Mercedes with both quick cars trying to bring developments to catch up to the Red Bulls. And then by the second half of the season, we might have multiple winners of multiple teams, 3 teams plus potentially. But the way it presently looks, that is not going to happen anytime soon. So very much interested in your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.